Hi, hello. Welcome to your Unit 1 set of videos. Please make sure that you know exactly what homework format you need to use, and go ahead and get started. Alrighty, my friends. So for today's topic, we are looking at the Olmecs. So we are actually going to go ahead and start looking at the Western Hemisphere and some of the Western Hemisphere civilizations that came out. So what are our objectives? Well, number one, when should world history start, right? Number two, how did individuals inhabit the Western Hemisphere? Number three, what are the key differences between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere civilizations? And then lastly, number four, what influence did the Olmecs have to the Western civilizations? So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with just a general overview of early societies of Mesoamerica. And when I talk about Mesoamerica, I'm specifically talking about present-day Mexico, or at least central southern Mexico, all the way through until present-day Honduras, El Salvador. So that's the general region here. And on this map, I have all of the civilizations that came out in the Western Hemisphere. So much is very unclear about the early population of the Americas, but this is what we know, okay? There was this large migration of people from Siberia to Alaska, probably about 13,000 BCE. And you might be thinking, well, there's actually no way for people to cross between Siberia and present-day Alaska. But about 13,000 years ago, this whole entire area that's in this light blue, this was all covered in ice. So there's actually a land bridge that people could walk through. So that's what we for sure know of how people got to the Americas. There's also another possibility that some individuals reached the Americas by watercraft, or perhaps by actually sailing and navigating the seas, as well as just drifting across the waters. And this is what this image is supposed to indicate. So there could have been some individuals from Australia, present-day Australia, Indonesia, perhaps China, and Japan who were sailors. So several excavations in both North and South America have shown remains that date to 15,000 BCE or earlier, which indicates and shows us that there were a few groups that most likely made their way to the Americas before this big mass migration happened from Siberia. So that's what we know about the early Mesoamerican societies. So after 13,000 BCE, migrants arrived in large numbers through North America and slowly trickling down to South America. And they quickly inhabited all regions of the Western Hemisphere that was able to be lived in. Okay? But by 9,500 BCE, these group of individuals finally reached the southernmost part of South America. So by 9,500 BCE, almost all of North and South America were at least looked at and searched through by these early peoples. The early human inhabitants of the Americas lived exclusively by hunting and gathering. But by around 8,000 BCE, it became very difficult to continue hunting and gathering. So these individuals had to change their lifestyle. So this is where we're going to focus on. We're going to focus mainly on the Olmecs, right? The first kind of known civilization in Mesoamerica. So by 8,000 to 7,000 BCE, these peoples, the Olmecs, began to experiment with cultivation, with squash, manioc, beans, chili peppers, avocados, grouds. And by 4000 BCE, there was this discovery of maize, which became the number one important food in this region. Maize is the equivalent of corn. Agricultural villages appeared soon after 3000 BCE, and by 2000 BCE, agriculture has spread throughout Mesoamerica. And I want you to think after this point and throughout the video of this question. How does this compare to the other civilizations that we've looked at, whether by time period, whether by discovering how to farm, products, etc.? Diet was rich in all these various types of food, but unlike the Eastern Hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere didn't have a lot of rich protein through animals. So in Mesoamerica, they definitely were able to domesticate, for example, turkeys and small dogs, but everything else they were not able to domesticate. Number one reason, for example, there was no cattle, no such thing as sheep, as cows in Mesoamerica. So there wasn't as much animal protein. So they had to grab it from their fruits and vegetables. When it comes to the Olmecs, human laborers were foundational for preparing the fields for cultivation as well as carrying their goods backwards, back and forth. Why? Once again, there were no large animals to domesticate like horses or ox, for example. Yeah, there are llamas, but they're incredibly skittish. They're not super duper big enough to carry goods back and forth. So this was all essentially created, brought back and forth by humans. So when it comes to any Western civilization, the key component of them are these beautiful ceremonial centers that you see here in front of you. And towards the end of the second millennium BCE, there are these elaborate centers with these ginormous pyramids, very similar, but not exactly the same, very similar to the ancient Egyptians. No, it's not ancient aliens. They also had temples and beautiful big palaces. But these ceremonial centers were not the main areas for living. They were used for special occasions, for example, to observe some sort of ritual, or perhaps to go to the centers for market, right, to buy and sell various goods. But most of the population did not live in these centers. The first Olmec ceremonial centers arose about 1200 BCE on the site of the modern town of San Lorenzo, and it served as their capital for about 400 years. So let's dive in a little bit more into the Olmecs, or the rubber people. So this is the earliest known civilization in Mesoamerica, but this civilization is incredibly mysterious. For example, their name. They were coined the Olmecs, which means the rubber people, only because rubber trees flourished in this region. And so various archaeologists decided to call them Olmecs, rubber people, because that's what the main source was being grown there. But we actually do not know what they called themselves, which is quite a shame. It is certain, however, that the Olmec cultural traditions influenced all of the other Mesoamerican societies that we're going to see throughout class until the Europeans arrived in the 16th century. So even though we don't know a lot about the civilization, it was super duper instrumental to civilizations like the Aztecs, for example. So looking at their society, they're most likely authoritarian, meaning that they had a very strong central government that had all the power, and the people had very limited political freedoms. Their societal structure was also probably just like divided into two, like a triangle. So the top half was like the rulers, the elites, the priests, and then the bottom half was just the common day, everyday average Joe. Thousands of laborers participated in the construction of these ceremonial sites, and each of these sites featured a very elaborate, complex temples, pyramids, altars, stone sculptures, and tombs for their rulers. And the common subjects most likely delivered a portion of their harvest to maintain the elite class living style in these ceremonial centers. And they were the ones that provided the labor for all of these large scale projects. The artistic creations of the Olmecs are incredibly interesting. They are these ginormous human heads, as you see right up here. And they're most likely, we don't actually 100% know, but they're most likely heads of the rulers during that time. And they were sculpted by basalt rocks in the area. So trade in jade obsidian. And make sure you take a nice, good look at this map over here to help you out. So the influence extended to much of central and southern regions of what is modern day Mexico and beyond the modern day Guatemala and El Salvador. Their influence was partly by military force, but it was actually mainly by trade. They had two main sources or two main goods that they would trade, jade and obsidian, but they actually had to be imported from the interior of Mesoamerica. So for example, on this map, you see the source of jade in this circle greenish, right, is in southern modern day Mexico. And there's also another spot here in Guatemala. So a lot of these things had to be imported to the Olmec site. But once they got it, they would create these beautiful, magnificent objects. So for example, with jade, they would create a large number of decorative objects. Like for example, you have a beautiful face right here. Or perhaps with obsidian, they would create these very, very sharp knives and axes. In exchange for their imports, right, the Olmecs would trade small works of art made from jade, balsa, or perhaps ceramic. So going to the decline of the Olmecs, it's one of the most mysterious falls of the Western civilization. Here's why. They essentially systematically destroyed all of their ceremonial centers and they deserted their sites. Archaeologists, when they found these sites, they saw statues that were broken, buried, monuments were being defaced, and the capitals themselves seemed like they were burnt. Although there could have been intruders that came into the ceremonial centers, scholars believe that the Olmecs deliberately, on purpose, destroyed their capital. It could have been because of maybe some sort of civil conflict, like a civil war happening inside there, or perhaps doubts of the effectiveness or the legitimacy of the ruling classes. But we just do not know. By about 400 BCE, the Olmec society had fallen on hard times, and soon after, essentially all the other Mesoamerican societies were starting to eclipse the Olmecs, and they essentially were just gone from the history books. But one of the key important things about the Olmecs are their traditions and how they have stuck throughout time. Olmec traditions deeply influenced later Mesoamerican societies. For example, they made astronomical observations and they created a calendar to keep track of their seasons. For example, look over here in this image, right? The very far left one is the Olmec version. Then you see the Mayans also created some sort of calendar system. And then you have the very famous Aztec calendar system. This was the Mayans and the Aztecs were both influenced by the Olmecs creating their own, as well as the invention of a writing system. Unfortunately for the Olmecs, there are very, very few writing examples to date, but what we do know is based on the calendars that the Olmecs have created. They also, interestingly enough, would carry out rituals that involved human sacrifice, and we'll see another example of that with the Mayans and the Aztecs especially, as well as they invented a very distinctive ball game, which Some individuals think could have been like the precursor to like American football, or perhaps even the precursor to lacrosse as well. And this right here, this image is just a makeup of what it would have looked like. Later, Mesoamerican peoples adopted all these Olmec traditions, as well as their cultivation of maize and their construction of ceremonial centers with temple pyramids. So they're incredibly important and significant to look at when we have to look at the Mesoamerican civilizations. And that is where we're going to end it today, my friends. So, what do we learn? Hey, humans are still complex. Human migration can happen both on land and water. Western civilizations domesticated plants and animals much, much later in history, most likely because of their migration. And then lastly, the Olmecs were essential for the foundation for future civilizations in Western Hemisphere. Wow, what a fantastic, invigorating, insightful, productive, wonderful video that Miss I has created for you. Yes, I know, you can go ahead and clap for me. It's totally fine. Please, please, please make sure that you have completed whatever homework format I have asked and given to you for this video, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Goodbye.